And I was reflecting on, as you spoke, why we chose transition as opposed to transformation. And I remember now, it was 6 years after independence, and at least almost 30 years into post-independence the rest of Africa. And some of us had had experience in post-colonial Africa, Botswana, Zambia, Mozambique, Tanzania. And when we came to back in 1980, the experience or the pathologies of post-colonial Africa were very alive to some of us. And the study of the African state had been, by African scholars, had been very advanced by that stage. So I remember clearly that the word transformation, and I'm wondering why we are using it. It appears to me to be historically inappropriate, if not fallacious. In 1986, it was also used in transition as opposed to transformation. Perhaps was a degree of frustration and indeed betrayal, a sense of that the post-liberation struggle had been betrayed. So when I hear the South Africans screaming all over transformation, transformation, I'm reminded that perhaps they're not yet grounded in the realities of this thing that we call the state in Africa. Secondly, in using the word transition, 30 years afterwards, 35 years after independence in Zimbabwe, we need also to be very clear, and this morning's discussion refers, we're not yet clear as exactly what model we're looking for. In 1986, you can forgive us, there was still a debate. You even had it on TV, the road to socialism. There was still a debate as to whether it was possible to have a socialist strategy. Even in retrospect, it was a very, very rhetorical debate and even false in many respects. Because the nationalists, including yours truly, Mugabe, they hated socialism intrinsically. If the chair can give me just a minute to digress, to make my point quickly, because I've been to meetings where there's an allegation that Zimbabwe failed in the early years because there was a determined attempt to bring about socialism. I think it was May or June 1980, we went on a state visit to Tanzania with Mugabe. I had just come back from Tanzania a few months earlier, where I was teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam. We were staying in the Kilimanjaro Hotel. There was no sugar, no milk, there was no nothing, to use the colloquial term. These were the hardships that some Zimbabweans got to know much later. Sitting next to me was Bernard Chidero, and around the table was Enos Nkala, was Minister of Finance, Chidero Economic Planning, and various other ministers. And Chidero said very sarcastically, says, Enos, this is what people like Ibo Mandaza want us to have in Zimbabwe. This socialism thing. And Enos Nkala hit the table. He said, Mandaza, I'll kill you if you try to bring this. We don't want anything like this in our country, speaking in Shona, of course, so that our host would be here. But the point now, so clearly in the 80s, the debate on the road, on which road to take was there. But looking back now, clearly, and the reference discussion, but clearly what we had as a model, implicitly, and still have it, is a bourgeois democracy model. And no one is saying it. It is a bourgeois model democracy. When Lloyd speaks as he has, he's outlining a bourgeois democracy model. And I'm saying that in this era, historical juncture, we cannot escape the bourgeois democracy model. And therefore, if we want to understand why we not have been able to approximate the bourgeois democracy model, we need to understand why. First, Lloyd made the point at the beginning, reference to agency for change. The debate about the national bourgeoisie in Africa as the anchor class for development, for developmental democracy, is old. But I'm surprised that scholars are not putting it on the table. If you remember, Amilcar Cabral lamented the fact that there was no national bourgeoisie to take over power. He didn't use the term. So there was no anchor class to take over power. Now, the national liberation movements, ANC, ZAPU, and even ZANU-PF belatedly, always discussed, and Joe Slovo was most categoric, the idea of the national democratic revolution. The implication thereby that the national liberation movement is that which takes the place of a national bourgeoisie, to take charge of the developmental state, to move it forward. Clearly, by 1986, we already could realize that the national liberation movement was failing. Today, it's clear the national liberation movements of Southern Africa have been a failure as possible vehicles for the kind of development state we're talking about. So what do we do? What class do we look for? The national bourgeoisie, Samir Amini would say it's impossible to have a national bourgeoisie in this conjuncture. And I think he's right. Because what we have bequeathed post-independence Africa is a comprador bourgeoisie. And Brian, you are right. The comprador bourgeoisie includes the bureaucratic bourgeoisie, clearly. The comprador bourgeoisie are the most tragic situation that has ever been created in our countries. And if you remember the term comprador from the Chinese, it's a class of agents, pimps, corporate pimps mainly. People don't work, we just take anything they can grab. They're grabbers, basically. They're thugs. And when you are run by a comprador class like we are run by thugs, clearly. They have no national vision, because they're incapable of imagining it. They're parasitic, they're predatory by their nature. They have no investment in the future because they don't think there's a future. They're insecure, and that feeds their greed, because they don't know where the next dollar will come from. So what we have, as I said earlier in the morning, we have this conflation of power and compradorism. The task is difficult in terms of transition, or if you want to use the word transformation, or maybe as a transformation towards a bourgeois democracy model. And I was going to conclude by saying that some of us have been meeting, some of us in this room have been meeting over the last few weeks, concerned at the danger that the political and economic pathology that we're experiencing now can be reproduced tomorrow. Our biggest fear is the possibility that ZANU-PF will call elections tomorrow to preempt what is clearly a sinking ship. And we will have definitely a reproduction of the sectocrat state as we have it. Or even if we get into elections 2018, a new dispensation will not be so new if certain things are not done. the temptation for the reproduction of the current pathology is there for anybody who gets into power. We saw it in the GNU. So we are trying to call upon ourselves as citizens to lay at least the bare minimum preconditions for reform before the next elections. And those of you who have seen our newsletter, Surface newsletter, will find that. But I think my colleagues, some of whom are here, will speak louder about it later on. And we thought that the first is political reform. The minimum is the implementation of the new constitution, which is not so new now. In particular, the separation of powers, restoration of national institutions, public sector reform. Public sector is rotten to the core. And the focus is always on ministers when we discuss, look at the whole public service, it needs to be looked at. Electoral reform. Then, of course, economic reforms. Lloyd made the point, the need for some kind of economic plan that puts industrialization to create jobs, to create wealth, to bring back our diaspora, or at least a proportion of it. 50% or more, or 60% of all professionals in Zimbabwe are outside the country at the moment. And this has had an impact on politics, as you can see. It has had an impact on the economy, as is evident. We're now, out of all economically active, I'm sure Kanyenza will be speaking on that. Of all economically active people in Zimbabwe, only 4% are employed, or 83,000 people employed in the private sector. The rest are in the public sector. 500,000 civil servants, including army and police, and another 150,000 in the parastatals, so-called. So that's where we are. And we need to, I hope Kanyenza will speak on it, but we need to outline clearly and empirically what should be done as a minimum to get the economy going. No more fancy sort of scenarios, clearly grounded, taking into account the realities that confront us. The need for a land policy that respects property rights and all the bourgeois democracies and freedoms that are necessary for the model, the bourgeois democracy model, which we don't want to talk about, but it's clearly and implicitly that which we are talking about. Thank you.
But there is I think one of the major challenges already is the death of democracy, those very associations. I think, as the earlier speaker said, Comrade Kako rightly, that part of the achievement of ZANU-PF dictatorship has been to actually mutate down to the lowest grade of society. You go to those very same organizations, you discover that those who formed those organizations will not go anywhere until God says come, as Mugabe would put it. So, and then the second aspect is the clear emasculation and the shutting out of young people from the platforms that are there. Be it in political parties, be it in CSOs, down to the village level. If there's a serious village meeting going on, young people's duties are to go in skin coats and to go around looking for peculiar for the elders to discuss the issues. And this goes all the way up to political parties. Young people are balkanized in a youth wing of sort, the same in civic society. You lack the voice of young people in the critical sectors. How are we involving young people in residents associations? How are we involving young people in the informal economies, you're saying, those associations? How are young people taking up leadership at the core that matters? Because I believe that even if you look at the liberation struggle, the swing point was the participation of young people in order to change that. So for me, that is where the challenge I see it. And unless we begin to do away with that mentality and give genuine platforms for the young people to radically speak their voice, it will be difficult to embark on a process of reimagining the transformation that we're trying to do. And then lastly, I have a question for Dr. Mandazai. You were talking about the bourgeois driven democracy and the national bourgeois as a driving force for probably as the anchor class, as you say. But the challenge now is we already don't have a national bourgeois at the moment. There's limited gross capital formation. There's high informalization of the economy. And probably the few dollars that we have are being externalized by a few elites that are connected. So we can't really base economic transformation, for me, in my view, on a national bourgeois. I think for Zimbabwe, going forward, my argument would be say we need to anchor it on the young people and women, because are the ones involved already in other economic activities that we have. So the role of the state must say, how then do we empower this? But I want to understand you, how do you envisage a bourgeois class when we don't have gross capital formation and there's so much informalization? Thank you.
Your thoughts, Lloyd, on cadre or cadre development. It seems to me we assume that the cadres that will run the state, should we reform it, the public sector and so on and so forth, will naturally and organically grow. One of the things that has happened is the whittling down of those institutions that used to train and equip the public servants, and the spaces that are actually responsible for this. So I'm just your thoughts on that. And then the second, of course, I mean, in analysis, obviously, there was this classical, the elite of labor, leisure, elite of labor, which is, I think, basically what we have. Largely, the new bourgeoisie, this civil society lot, and teachers, and so on and so forth. Is it possible that, and BT alleges that this is a traitor class, right? Is it possible that we can, in this elite of labor, very few elite of leisure, that we can deal with the one issue which seems a bit of a sticky point, which is the conscientization and politicization? Because the short-termism that you're talking about seems to be as rampant in civil society as it is in other spaces. And yet this could be an engine and a catalyst for some of the revolutionary impetus. Then lastly, Piketty, 2 revisions have happened over the last 10 years that I found interesting. Is the celebration of Piketty's offing on new economic thinking or economic thinking, basically because there's nothing new about it. And the second is Fukuyama's revision of his old statement that there is no alternative to neoliberal democracy. In his new book, he talks about the imperative of public sectors. He's moving towards a social democratic model, which is still bourgeois, but is veering towards a little bit of left of center. And I wanted to hear your views in the light of what you're saying, because we've had political parties here say they are social democrats. And I was jokingly saying, if you ask them, what do you mean? The thing collapses there. And what are the prospects of social democracy as we know it, the classic, whether it's the classic as it originated in Western Europe or the new forms in Zimbabwe, in light of what you say there about the democratic model?
Surely, after the 1986 book up to now, I'm hoping that, given that incisive introduction in the book, I'm hoping that by now you have maybe, I don't know, I don't want to use the word to say improve, but you have rethought certain things, especially around the progressive class. This thing that you talked about, but did not really go into it, around Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, etc. Which class would you look at if it was to say this is the progressive class to take Zimbabwe? Then also in it, with the conjuncture that we're in, what are the prospects for mobilization in it? Professor Sachikonye, I would love to respond, but I made an oath to people that I'm not going to talk about the book until 5:30. So I'll get back to you.
Maybe I should start with the question on the prospects of cadre development and also the possibility of the petty bourgeoisie becoming a progressive class, much more progressive than it has been. If we look back to the independence movement or the national liberation movement, I think there you had an example of a petty bourgeoisie that was able to play a progressive role in the struggle. Amilcar Cabral used to write about the need for class suicide, I think in metaphorical terms, but I think he was serious on another level in the sense that this was a class that could link up with other classes, and in that process commit some kind of transition, if you like, and be able to work with the peasants, with the workers, with the students, and other forces in society. And I think they were able to do that within the national liberation movement. I think that's one example of the petty bourgeoisie playing, I think, a progressive role. And why shouldn't it happen again, although the conditions might have changed 30 years after independence? But I think there's room there to explore possible openings for this class that we are talking about. Developing cadres, I think it's an important issue because I think the process of building the state is still a crucial one. Our states are not yet strong enough, efficient enough, progressive enough. And I think we need to give some thinking to that. It's also some forward thinking in the sense that it'll be very difficult to work with the, with the old wine, with existing cadres, some of whom would have joined the comprador bourgeoisie that we are talking about. There was a question about associations, and I think there were two views from the floor. One was that the associations are they've done their best, almost complacent to say that we've done everything that is possible. I would caution about, that kind of position. I think there's always room to do more, whether it's pushing for electoral reform, whether it's pushing for local development, representation at various levels, and so on. And I agree that the youth are a potentially very crucial part of this process. They can play quite a progressive role in associations. Because quite clearly they are being abused, by political parties and by other forces because of the social conditions of unemployment. And I think that abuse certainly has to stop. And I think a much more progressive role carved out with the youth. The last issue that was raised has to do with activism, a kind of a manual to revive activism. I think you are really the best people, being at the front line to answer that through your practice. I'm not sure whether one can give a theoretical answer to the issue of how to revive activism. But I think the book, in a sense, reminds us, that there are all these active associations, so many, in the urban arena, in the rural areas, but there is no wider national vision. There's no synergy between them. And one can suggest that there is power, there will be power in those synergies if they are created. There's power that could be derived from that national vision if it is developed.
If you're not say so, but I think most Zimbabweans are very upset and angry at what's happening. And we get these questions asked of us when we travel outside the country. Why is Zimbabweans taking all this nonsense? I think that you cannot rule out the possibility of social unrest in this country, if there isn't already. The deterrent, of course, is this formidable securocratic state. But as in all securocratic states, they are strong physically, but they're very brittle. Very brittle and very given to sudden explosion. We might be seeing that already in Zimbabwe. We can't rule out the outward expression of anger very soon if this continues the way things are going. Having said that, I'm more concerned about the agency for change. Yes, I agree that the neoliberal hegemony is real, that behind the social democracy of Western Europe is perhaps an advanced stage of the bourgeois democracy model, even approaching the socialist level that people like Lenin wrote about. As you can see in the reduction in the working hours, reduction in the working week, and so on and so forth. These are, you can see an advanced stage of capitalist development, which is bringing together new social relations. For us, you are too far from that. Yes, I would like to see a national bourgeoisie in Zimbabwe. Perhaps if there is a revival of the economy, industrialization, and we become less dependent on extractive industries, in which case our goods are just sent out to enrich the factories of the north and the Far East. We could have a formidable national bourgeoisie emerging. But in the meantime, and this also to answer Tendai's question, in the meantime, the solution is the reform of the state, along the lines I've indicated earlier. Reform of the state and revival or restoration of national institutions. Probably one of the oldest in this room, so you're going to remember 1980, but things worked, huh? 1980. We had national institutions, very professional. The first corruption case in the public service was about 1988. A customs officer took a bribe of $1,000 in dollars at the time. So it's largely a clean public service. The police are very professional. Remember, we introduced ZRP from BSAP. Commissioners of police served 2 terms and left. The head of the army, 2 terms and left. Today, the head of the army is, I think, 17, 18 years. The police, I think, over 20 years. So the extent to which national institutions have been subverted is evident in the mess that we have. But it is possible to get back there. And it is this middle class, yourselves, but in particular, the younger generation, who must be very angry and upset at what's going on. And I think that one of the things some of us have been saying for a long time, that we need generational change in leadership. Because the kind of vigor with which we worked in 1980, we were working 18 hours a day. The fear of failing, the quest of having Zimbabwe succeed was so contagious across society. People came back in their thousands. Sometimes people worked 6-8 months, no pay. I think it's possible that anger in Zimbabwe, both at home and abroad, among Zimbabweans, I think we can get back to that stage. And I think it's this class of people that can lead us to a brighter future. Thank you.
So Machisa, we used to say in the student movement, if you are not upset and angry, then you are not paying attention. So, but I do get, the point. We need to see the expression of that in a much more, I think, concrete way. I wanted to bring us again to the issue of reimagining the transformation, which again for me is an issue around thinking, of what's possible. What are the possibilities before us when you're talking about a different kind of democracy, partly outlined in the manifesto is raised, by Prof. Sachikonye. I think it's okay to say we've got 3,000 or more different forms of associational formations. But what we have seen is that sometimes these platforms can actually act as mechanisms for escaping collective responsibility to act. I mean, by collective, I mean in a much broader national sense. So we can have, if we look at my neighborhood in Merrick Park, we have several forms of, platforms that bring us together. But sometimes it's to come together to say, look, these days, the best thing to do is to disconnect from ZESA, put on your own solar system. And it's a network of people who can afford that. And it somehow has an effect of demobilizing the broader quest around saying service delivery is a right. It must be going even to my gardener, to someone on the street, to everyone. What has happened to this huge parastatal called ZESA that we've pumped millions of dollars in? So there are various ways that associational life can also be demobilizing towards the broader national struggle or quest. And I think the issue that I'll pose to you as a question is the prospects of harnessing the expression that we are seeing, the expression towards something collective that we're seeing in these associations to become this, formidable national thrust or force for transformation. And the last thing that I want to mention is, again, when you're talking about reimagining, and I'll pose it as a question. When we talk about democracy from below, for me, the things that I'm seeing is very local forms of election, where maybe you even elect the education superintendent for that area. You maybe even elect the police chief for your area. Everything is anchored in local elections, and it then builds maybe towards regional assemblies, and then from that, maybe the regional assemblies are the ones that will elect your national president. Because I don't think we've been served very much by this idea of an imperial president that comes in and concentrates power rather than separate. Instead of separation of powers, it's more concentration of powers at a government level, but even within the individual parties that take over power. So if we are talking about fundamental change, let me pose it to you as a question. What do you see as the prospects of something that builds from below like that, where you are elected like that, but also you are recallable? If you are not serving the interests of the communities that you are representing, we won't wait 5 years. We have mechanisms that say you can be recalled. Thank you.
When you talked about the necessity of freehold property rights, my question is, doesn't this entrench what we can call democracy bourgeoisie? Because historically, we have seen, here in Zimbabwe and in other African countries, we have seen that freehold property rights actually leads to the concentration of land within a few people. So that's my first question. Then the second question I'll direct to Professor Sachikonye, and ask that related to the question of developmental democracy. Which path do we pursue in trying to achieve it? Because we know that within the political party systems, there are always class contradictions. Since morning, we've heard about the conflicts which are in political parties, factions. So the question here is, how do you operationalize that? Do we go the social movement route, as was propounded by Moyo and Eros 2005, as a way of bringing that developmental democracy? Thank you.
Even in bourgeois democracy, there are ways of controlling or curtailing the sort of land barons that we see so rampant in our society at the moment. But I was really referring to the fact that right now there's a big debate about tenure. That most Zimbabweans still live in the rural areas. And some of us have been pushing that even those rural home households be given tenure, title. And someone's being romantic and saying, oh, Ndoatnova, Mushagwedu, and so on and so forth. Forgetting that you're not supposed to be there anyway. You're forced there. So why romanticize something in which you're forced? But I think that the idea of giving tenure to households in the rural areas as well would mark a very progressive stage, quite apart from the kind of anarchy that's going on at the moment with respect to commercial farming and so on and so forth. And I don't know if you're aware that many of those who were given aid to farms, especially the elite, political elite, many of them have quietly got their title deeds by arranging payments to the former white commercial farmers and get the title deeds. So while you have this slogan saying the Torah Mindaedu and so on and so forth, we're taking our land, quietly, many of the elites, political elites, actually have title deeds for the farms they got under A2. So I think we need a more transparent debate about the issue of corporate rights. Thanks.
The notion about this type of democracy is emphasis on equitable development, emphasis on socio-economic rights as being equally important as political rights. But as I pointed out in my presentation, I think to put developmental democracy and electoral democracy as binaries, as either or, I think it's mistaken, because we need elements of democratic rights, political rights, just as we need rights to develop it, to material aspects of development. They are all important. It was, I think, an Indian scholar, Amartya Sen, who described development as freedom, as opening up to all other, kinds of freedom. So there is symbiosis about these two aspects, the development and, the political aspect. And to try to, to separate them, I think is mistaken. And I think it's also mistaken in terms of strategy, ultimately. Then finally, there was an issue about collective associations, associational life. Yes, they can have a demobilizing effect. And the question is, how can they work together? There certainly is no manual about this? I think the answer will actually come through the consultations, the practices, between those various associations. I don't think this is an idea. I mean, this will be an innovative idea in the Zimbabwean context. And I think the associations themselves have to work this through to see how they can establish synergies between themselves, and also how they can define, should they decide, how they can define the broader vision towards which they can work. The most that one can do would be point maybe to other practices, best practices in other national settings. But one national setting is not the same as the Zimbabwean national setting. So the innovative thinking aspect still comes in, and it has to come from within the associations themselves. Local democracy, about recalling those who don't carry out the mandate. I'm inclined to agree with you, but of course this also relates to the kinds of contracts that you draw up for these various representatives, and also this particular context in which that does happen. But yes, it's an important theme in local democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Very effective, Chair.